We'll give you a little bit of a primer on the 1812 invasion, and then I'll introduce you to Faber de Faur, and then we'll spend most of our time today looking at some of the images that he produced to capture this campaign. So this map, it just sort of illustrates the route that the French army took when they invaded Russia, and they invaded. There are a couple of reasons why they invaded. There were some control issues in Poland. Napoleon wanted to save the Polish from the Russian threat, but more importantly, there was a continental system that Napoleon had set up as a commercial blockade against Britain. He wanted to force them to surrender, and the Russians weren't observing that. They were sort of cheating. They were trading with Britain through proxies. So that was the justification for the invasion. And he invaded with 600,000 troops and 250,000 horses for the artillery as well as the cavalry. And it was 1,000 kilometers from, this is the border, they went all the way up to Moscow, 1,000 kilometers, and then back. So we'll take a little bit of a look at this invasion. This is a famous map depicting the invasion, and this was done by Charles Menard. He was a French military engineer and very interested in cartography. He did this in 1869, so it was long after the invasion. And today we would call this an infographic. It's one of the first versions of an infographic, meaning there are multiple data dimensions in this slide. But really the main one I want to point out to you is this tan. That represents the size of the French army. So when they started, they were that big, and as they moved, that's Moscow, they were that small. But then the black going back is the retreating army. So you can see, so it just depicts how big it was and then how small it was when it got back. So it was just a tiny fraction of what it was when it retreated. And that was all in the course of 6 months. And that infographic, it also has geography, temperature, latitude, longitude. So there are a number of data elements, but really the key one is the size of the army. Now, Faber de Faur, people think that the invasion was the French army. That's not really true at all. At least half of the troops going in were foreign-based troops. And this just gives you an illustration of the number of different nationalities that participated in this invasion. I've highlighted the yellow because that was the division of Faber de Faur. And you'll see that they had 15,000 troops. Yeah, 15,000 troops in that particular division that went into Russia. And this is one of the sources I used. This is a book that was published in early 2000 by Jonathan North. The collection has a couple of publishers that we work with. And his book covers all 92 images that Faber de Faur created. We're going to look at about a little less than a third of them today. In the resources, he lists 240 memoirs that are references of survivors of this campaign. And what's unique about Faber de Faur is that his is really the only one that's artwork that captures this disastrous campaign. And excuse me, sorry, wrong direction. Some of the other sources I used were some of the different memoirs, and I got sort of a mix of them. The themes are generally pretty consistent, the deprivations that the soldiers experienced, but I have sort of a mix, and the one on the left, Jacob Walter, there's one of only 2 diaries that were done by enlisted men. Most of the diaries were done by officers. And we'll look at Captain von Brandt. He's a Polish officer, although he has a German name. And I did look at a modern source just for some context. And then this one here, Captain Coignet, is sort of a famous memoir. He was in the Imperial Guard and served with Napoleon for the entire Napoleonic period. And we'll use some quotes from Napoleon himself as he described the campaign. So I would like to introduce you to Faber de Faur. And you can see he has a French name, but he's German, so there's a lot of, mix and match. His family has French roots going back to the 15th century, strong family military tradition. He trained as a lawyer, but he was a professional illustrator, and he joined the Army in 1809, and was with Napoleon in 1812 when they went into Russia. He received an honor, the Legion of Honor, for his bravery at the Battle of Smolensk. And this is one of the images just showing his artillery unit in action at Smolensk. And so one of the things that's sort of unique about this is that he's a professional soldier and he's a professional artist. That combination is very, very unique. And just as a sidebar, here in Greenwich, you have one of your own, John Cullen Murphy, who was similar, a World War II artist and soldier with MacArthur in the Pacific, but that's a story for another day. One of the things that's important to understand about this is that he survives the retreat. So in 1812, he comes back and survives. And of that division of 15,000 troops, only 100 survive. So for posterity, the fact that he survived with this sketchbook, he kept a sketchbook during the entire campaign, sketching everything that he saw. He miraculously survives, one of 100 out of 15,000. So it was really incredible that he made it. And what he does in 1816, he does a small exhibit of some of his artworks, and these are just some of the, some of the sketches he does. He does this small exhibit of the sketches in 1816, so it's 4 years after the campaign. But really, the bigger thing that happened was in 1827, he's contracted to take his sketches and make full-color artwork. And this is a project that took 3 years, from 1827 to 1830. And he does it in collaboration with one of his fellow survivors, this Lieutenant Frederick von Kausler. Kausler's not an artist, he's just sort of a sounding board, and they're talking about all the images that Faber de Faur is working up into full-color art. This was in a controlled environment, so they're in a studio, and they had a lot, it was basically 3 years to do 92 images of full-color artwork, so that was very controlled. And then those images were started to be sold in 1831. Just a note on the provenance of the collection. So we acquired this artwork, Mrs. Brown acquired it in 1957 at an auction in Munich, and it contains 16 separate watercolors that are mounted on cards. You can see these cards here, and then inside this album are 73 images of colored ink, watercolor, and water sketches. And so that's sort of a little bit of an introduction to the provenance. This is the album. So he didn't have this with him when he was in Russia. This is it was like an album that he put his artwork in when he came back. And just to give you a sense of what it looks like inside. So they're nicely mounted. This is sort of his memento from the campaign. So you can see they're very nicely mounted. And these are some of the sketches. So as we start the campaign, this is the first image that he did, and the army is on the banks of the Niemen River. They're ready to go into Russia. They're ready to attack. They're all sort of, roaring and ready to go. The campaign is kicking off. And one of the things about this campaign was that even from the beginning, they were really short on a lot of supplies. Food, the logistics were not good, the roads weren't good, and the army started, suffering almost immediately, even before the invasion. The land had been picked over, so they were short on supplies. And one of the things they would do is trade with the locals. So when they first went in, many locals left, but the Jewish community stayed. And this is a sketch of a soldier trading with some of the local Jewish community. And then he would work it up into more detailed studies, and then the final artwork is this image here. So you can see he's embellished it with sort of these other troopers around here, and he's trading here a fur coat with the local community. And he tells us, so when he did these images, he also put accompanying text. And he says, a single loaf of bread cost 6 crowns, and even animal skins became an object of trade and were sold to local Jews. So you can see that commerce happening there. Now, another thing, because of the supplies being so short, and 600,000 troops, they had to forage constantly, and this is the sketch that he did in the field of a trooper going out on a forage campaign. And then this is the the worked up final art. Faber de Faur tells us, we were not issued with any food, nor did we come across supplies or inhabitants willing to sell them. We were obliged to scour the land with detachments and take what we needed by force. So you can see that they're out there getting all sorts of random supplies, bringing them back to camp. And as they come back, they ride into camp perched on their mounts. Another huge aspect of this campaign were the horses. So, there was deprivation for the troops in terms of food and supplies, but there was a shortage of forage for the horses as well. And he tells us that, the horses were suffering and thousands of them were dying. He said, if poor food and inclement weather had thinned the ranks of the army, then green forage had done the same for the army's horses. Thousands, particularly French and German, had died. The cavalry sought out native Russian horses. It was both sad and amusing to see these stubborn and emaciated beasts trot past our camp, ridden by massive carabiniers and cuirassiers with their shiny boots virtually touching the ground. So you can see this sort of ridiculous image. His boots are almost on the ground on these little Russian horses. So 250,000 horses were involved in this campaign. 180,000 died during those 6 months. And basically, 6 months is 180 days. So the French army, they were losing on average about 1,000 horses every single day. Those huge losses. So up to this point, it's just sort of deprivation and dealing with supplies and logistics. But the army is suffering, and they're sustaining casualties even without being in combat. And this is an image of soldiers that have died from deprivation. And this is the sketch he did in the field, and now this is the final art image he worked up. And he says, that at each halt, at each camp, we noticed that the number of effective troops diminished. The vast majority of these exhausted troops turned into corpses, marking the twisted route of the army. 2 of the corpses we came across belonged to our light infantry. One of them even had his tunic on back to front, the punishment meted out to those who had been straggling in the rear. So you see that his vest is on backwards because of punishment because he was a straggler. And in the course of this 6 months, the army experienced influenza, dysentery, typhus, diphtheria. All of these diseases caused huge casualties in the army. And Napoleon was trying to use what we would call today sort of a shock and awe strategy to get the Russians to lose quickly. And one of the diaries, Walter's diary, talks about moving 70 miles in 2 days. So if you're marching 70 miles in 2 days, you are moving that's quite a logistical feat to move that fast. The diary of Captain Coignet talks about an example of deserters. There were Spanish deserters. There were about 120 of them, and they were captured, and there was a bit of a skirmish when they captured them. And the rule of law in war is if you desert, the punishment can be death. And so the French, instead of executing all of them, drew lots and executed half. So I illustrate that just to show that sort of brutality of this campaign. And this was shooting their own guys. This was not the enemy. So this is just the suffering that they're experiencing before they're even really getting into big combat. So as they're moving in, so it's now August, the beginning of August, so they've been in a little over a month. There are starting to be some smaller skirmishes and engagements with the Russians. And what Faber de Faur tells us, he said, dead men and dead horses showed the various positions of the Russians and that the attacks of Murat and Eugene had been taken on a narrow front. The bodies had been exposed to the burning heat of the summer sun, and they were rotting. It was a horrible sight, and the air was thick for some distance with a stench of death. Our march through this scene was next to impossible. So small battles, they're sustaining casualties. He's seen the dead troopers. And I think in this illustration of his memoir, he didn't really candy coat anything. This is not really a propaganda document. He was really trying to show what happened. And one of the things I would point out here is you'll see these bare feet. So that was one of the first things. Shoes were one of the first things taken, either by other soldiers or by locals. The shoes had a huge value, for a long march. Now, a week later, they get to this Leonza camp, and they have some time. So they're there for 6 nights. They have a bit of time, and so they're able to build more sort of permanent structures. Usually on a march, if you're there just for 1 night, you don't have enough time to do that. So they have a little competition to build these fancier shelters compared to just a very basic bivouac. And he worked that up then into this image here, sort of final image. And he said, we built ourselves a proper camp at Leonza from materials furnished by the very fields. The regiments competed to see which unit would have the most elegant shelters. Routine chores helped lighten our mood and cares weighing down upon us. So you can just see them sort of at camp life, and they're having a bit of a respite. A week later, really the first really big battle occurs in the city of Smolensk. And this was a city that was ultimately destroyed by fire in the course of this battle. And you can see this is a very dramatic image of the color of the burning of the fire. And Faber de Faur writes, he said, we could see the cupolas of the cathedral right here, right in there. We could see the cupolas of the cathedral from our camp, and as we looked down on the city, we caught sight of huge columns of flames roaring up from the heart of Smolensk. The flame became more intense, formed a ball of fire that turned night to day, and lit the countryside for miles around. And he says, that they were enchanted and thought neither of our current plight nor of the terrible consequences the fire would have for us. And really the terrible consequence was that 85% of the city was destroyed. So during the retreat, Smolensk couldn't be used for supply, for winter quarters or anything. There was nothing to do in Smolensk on the retreat. So they had destroyed that city when they could have used it on the retreat. And this is another image in Smolensk. I wanted to show this just because Faber de Faur is in the artillery. And this is a walled city. You can see here all around this old walled city. And this is just, as I was going through all this material, it always struck me all the different ways that people could be injured or hurt or killed in this campaign. And this is just one more of them. He says, cannonballs still bounce towards us, plowing through the soil and showering us with earth and stones. Even if the missiles went harmlessly by and we thought the danger over, a number of us were still wounded by cannonballs ricocheting off the walls behind us and once again into our ranks. So you can see why it could hit here and go right into these guys. So it's just one more way they were experiencing, challenges in battle. So and also it's illuminated by the flame. So during this Battle of Smolensk, they engage with the locals, and they sort of get this woman to fetch them water. And she was really terrorized by having to do this. And he says that she was intimidated by the sight of these strange warriors and terrorized by the thunder of the guns and sinister whistling of the shells. She visibly trembled as she drew close to the scene of the struggle. Even so, fortune was with her. After carrying water to us a number of times at the risk of life and limb, she eventually managed to return safe and sound to her worried family. One of the things in all 92 images, we have these images of Russian civilians, but we don't really have images of the Russian troops, and that's for the simple reason that when the Russian troops were around, Faber de Faur was busy firing their cannons, so he didn't really have time to sketch them. But he was interested in the locals and their costume, and included them in his sketches and his work. So this is a sketch of Napoleon. This is the first sketch. There are 3 of Napoleon. And this is in Vyazma at the end of August. And this is the sketch that he did. Well, so Napoleon, you can see, is sitting here, sitting down. And he worked this up into this finalized image. And every time they caught sight of the emperor, it was always a signal that something suggested an imminent battle. And Faber de Faur says, we came across him again seated before a house, surrounded by his staff, in conversation with a Russian nobleman as troops marched past. So this is sort of typical Napoleonic, right? He's sort of, he's sitting down and making the nobleman stand, so it's sort of a very dismissive posture to take. His foot is up, it's really, and his arms are crossed. It's very, we've beaten you, you're subversive to us, so very, very sort of stereotypical Napoleonic image. But that foreshadowing is of this famous battle of Borodino. So this is the biggest battle during the campaign, and this is the battle that Tolstoy featured in War and Peace. And this is a huge battle. This is one scene from the battle where the cavalry commander Murat he's seeking shelter in this square. So in the 19th century, soldiers would form in squares and fire from those squares. And he's being chased by some Russians here, and he's going into the square to seek shelter. And, he's saved. Faber de Faur says, a vigorous fire from our light infantry soon repulsed the enemy's cavalry and assured the safety of Murat. And Murat was a bit of today we would call him sort of a flashy flyboy. You can see his uniform. It's very colorful, a big, bright white horse. The Russians had a lot of respect for him because he was very brave, but he was one of those characters that was invincible on the battlefield. He never seemed to get injured, and people around him were, and he just had a presence. And so this is capturing a sort of a positive or sort of a highlight moment from this huge battle. And but this battle is, this was the largest battle. The largest number of troops were engaged in it, and the casualties experienced were the highest numbers. So this is a sketch that was done on the aftermath of the battle, where he's sketching the casualties of the campaign. And this is sort of dramatic in describing this. I'll move to the permanent image. He says, "This is the battlefield long after the furious fighting had subsided, long after those violent passions had cooled. Bodies lie in heaps, enemy and friend alike united in profound peace. As we drew closer, we could see that the corpses were, after 11 days, rotting away." And he goes on to say, that Borodino was fought with 120,000 men on each side and more than 1,000 pieces of artillery, vomiting death and destruction the entire day. And what were the fruits of victory? Virtually nil. Each army corps had triumphed, yet still we were cheated of a decisive victory, and we had sustained heavy casualties. The Russian army had been beaten, but not destroyed. The trophies were out of all proportion to the sacrifices made, some 30 guns and only 1,000 prisoners. So it was just a horrific battle. Each side had 40,000 casualties. It was what we call a sort of Pyrrhic victory. The French lost 14 lieutenant generals, and 33 major generals were killed in this battle. And just on the French side, 90,000 artillery rounds were fired, and as I said, 40,000 casualties for both armies. And you can see again, of course, the bare feet of the participants. And Napoleon, sort of in one of the examples of fake news, wrote to the Austrian emperor. And the Austrians were their allies, but they were sort of shaky allies. And in this 19th century period, countries could switch sides depending on who was winning, what the political situation was at the time. But he writes to the Austrian emperor and says, we only had 10,000 casualties and the Russians had 40,000. So he totally understates his casualties sustained. And one other thing that's sort of macabre about this image is that the Polish captain von Brandt, he tells us that when you're trying to calculate mass casualties in the 19th century, the way you would do it is you would draw a rectangle, a small rectangle on the battlefield, and then in that rectangle you would count all the dead and wounded, and then you would figure out across a whole battlefield how many rectangles there were and multiply by the number that you got in your individual box, your individual rectangle to estimate casualties. So it's just sort of a grim math to calculate casualties in this period. With a battle of that size, there are huge numbers of wounded, and this is an image after the battle where they're wounded, and Faber de Faur tells us, crowds of wounded from both armies were scattered in countless villages after the Battle of Borodino. Sooner or later, these villages, either by chance or deliberately, burnt to the ground. It was these unfortunates, unable to flee on account of their wounds, found themselves at the mercy of the flames. Those that survived, some horribly mutilated, sought means to prolong their pitiful existence. So you can see these capturing these images of soldiers that have been caught in the fire and been burnt, and these guys here are just really, on their last legs. Building on that theme of macabre math of 19th century warfare, from experience, they knew Napoleon was writing to his chief of staff, and they were talking about the wounded. And Napoleon says, that of 6,000, we know in 45 days only 1,000 are left. So logistically, we only have to worry about 1,000, not the 6,000. Some had light wounds and would go back to their units, but most would die from their wounds. So it's just a grim calculation. They know that they only have to really deal with a smaller portion of the wounded. Now, we're getting to into September, and the French army is now arriving in Moscow. And that Battle of Borodino, the Russians, their tactic is they had been retreating into the vast size of their country. But at some point you have to stand your ground because there's a morale factor. If you just keep retreating, it seems like it can create defeatism in your own people. So they stood their ground at Borodino, they fought. It wasn't the best place to pick a battlefield from the Russian perspective, and they chose that battleground. But the Russian army, they couldn't hold Moscow. There was no military value in trying to hold Moscow, so they didn't defend Moscow. And the Russian army conceded Moscow to the French. And as they're going into the city, these are locals in the city who are there. Some of the locals didn't leave, many did, but they talks about how quiet the city was, and the only thing that they could hear were the hooves of the horses echoing on the ground. And at this time, when they came into the city, it was really the signal for fire. This is a dramatic element of this invasion where the Russians basically decided to not give the French the luxury of a fully, intact city. So they started fires. And the fires burned for 5 days. And he tells us, 2/3 of the city's buildings were now nothing more than heaps of ashes. Moscow became the graveyard of our every hope. Here and there, unfortunate inhabitants could be seen wandering in the grim labyrinth, hoping to discover that some part of their home had escaped destruction. So you can see a few of the troopers here, but these are the locals in this sort of burnt out city. And this is not an image in the collection, but just wanted to add this to show the perspective. This is the city of Moscow, and this is everything that burned. All the red is what burned. It's basically 95% of the whole city. Now, the French are in Moscow for 5 weeks, and Napoleon is wanting the Russians to surrender. That's why he's sort of lingering, and they're having some diplomatic exchanges. He writes to Tsar Alexander saying, that they had caught 400 arsonists and had them shot. So this is just, very dramatic destruction that the Russians started themselves. And I think that really shook Napoleon, that they were willing to destroy their own major city. It really, convinced him that there's going to be a lot more difficult to get them to surrender than I think he had initially thought. One of the buildings that survived a little bit better than a lot of the structures were churches. Only 50% of the churches were destroyed, and that's because they're mostly stone structures, but a lot of the things on the interior had been looted out, so there wasn't much to burn, so the churches had a little better survival rate. So it's now, we're into early October, and this is a park where the Württemberg artillery stored their cannons. They weren't using it. There wasn't really a lot of fighting in that month they were in Moscow. But this is sort of the precursor to what is called General Winter. General Winter is the Russian ally of the cold winter to kill the army. But really, they did, as you've seen, they suffered quite a bit during the summer. But what's interesting about this is this figure here. This is sort of foreshadowing the cold that they were about to experience. And Faber de Faur says, one of the sentries, a Dutch gunner, keeps out the cold with a fur cap, warms his hands in a muff, and under his greatcoat sports a nightgown. Such precautions were but the prelude to the universal adoption of attempts to keep out the cold. So that's just a sort of, you can see he's got this nightgown on under stress, so they're already starting to feel the coming of winter. But they are in the city for 5 weeks, and as I said, there wasn't a lot of they weren't really fighting the Russians at that point in time. And so they had some time for some, I guess you could call it, local sightseeing. And this is the Church of the Old Believers in Moscow. Faber de Faur and his colleagues went out to check it out. And this is like a sort of a respite during this entire campaign. And he says, that the surrounding area of Moscow was magnificent, covered in trees, and presenting a delightful appearance. Exploring the area, we came across a beautiful church hidden in a clump of trees. It was a most dazzling sight. Its cupolas were blue and speckled, with golden stars, and towered forth over the brilliant masses of autumnal leaves. So you can see this is sort of just a, so he's writing this book, 1820, it was published in 1831. So a lot of the people reading this book hadn't been to Russia, so they could see these images too. So a little bit of tourism or sort of local architecture, as well as, for example, the local costumes worn by the Russian natives. This is the Kremlin. It's now getting into sort of the latter part of October. The French army is getting ready to leave. And this is one more sort of bit of respite. This is a cathedral of the Annunciation. It was founded in 1397. And both Peter the Great and Catherine the Great were involved in some of its renovations. But during 1812, the square to the east of this church was filled with hundreds of French and Allied caissons, and they had been deposited within the Kremlin walls. What's interesting, and this is the only image where he talks about his art, he says the square was so congested that it was in fact rather difficult to find a suitable position from which to draw. The caissons were abandoned when we completed our retreat. So you can see, and this is just a sort of modern day photo of this cathedral. This is an image just the day before they were to leave Moscow, and what he's describing, the locals saying, that they hid in the ruins or in churches and spent their days like us in worry and care, hoping for better days to come. When Murat was surprised and beaten at Tartino by the wily Kutuzov, so there was a skirmish, there was a small battle outside of Moscow. This victory seemed to smile on the Russians for the first time. News of these events caused joy to the inhabitants. As we became discouraged, new hope was born amongst the Russians. So you can see they're sort of happy, they're sort of, the scuttlebutt, we've had a win, this is good, what's going to happen now? So they're excited about this turn of events in Russia's favor. And this is now the switch back to the retreat. This is our second image of Napoleon. And you can see he's sitting on his horse here, looking at his army as they're this sort of walking out. And he just says that it was on the 19th of October, we set out on the march that would result in the annihilation of the entire army. Time after time, the way was blocked by disorganized convoys for 500 guns, 2,000 wagons drawn by thousands of exhausted horses, and countless carts and vehicles of all types slowed us down. So you can see it's just this big mass all trying to get out. And the roads in Russia were not as good as the roads further in Western Europe. So they had more of challenges there just logistically. One of the in war there can be what are called friendly fire casualties, where you're accidentally shot by your own troops, and this was more an accident than friendly fire. But basically what's happening here is the army's retreating, and normally your rear guard would burn any of your stuff you had abandoned so the enemy wouldn't get it. But what happened here, he said, sometimes soldiers did not wait for the rear guard to come up, but attempted to destroy vehicles then and there, placing the troops marching past them in extreme danger. Here, for example, as some artillerymen attempt to rid themselves of a caisson, a mounted gendarme rides up and fires his pistol in order to set it ablaze. It explodes, costing the gendarme his life and burning a number of men most horribly. These would die a miserable death, but a few days later, as the march continued. So it's just an example of some of the crazy things that could happen. Von Brandt, that Polish captain, he mentioned in his diary, because they all were wearing so much extra clothing, it was sometimes hard to figure out which army was which army, and his unit was attacked by French cavalry and sabred. So that was a friendly fire incident too. So he describes, being attacked by your own allies. It's just a sort of just one more way that the war you could be hurt. So they're moving now. They left, in late October, and on November 7th, they're hit with this huge snowstorm. And it really pivots quite a bit. It just dramatically shifts in terms of weather. And they're starving. They have limited supplies, limited food. All the diaries talk about how little food they had, and there was a whole competition going on between soldiers to get food from each other, steal it from each other. They're suffering, and now on top of it now comes this cold. A furious storm blew huge flakes into our faces, flakes which soon settled and sought to obstruct our march. And the horses found the going difficult on the icy surface, and they gave up. The road began to be littered with frozen bodies, and these, soon covered with a snowy winding sheet, formed small mounds. The Russian winter finished off what starvation, exhaustion, and retreat had been unable to accomplish. The army disbanded and melted away. Now it resembled a rabble. Cold and an instinct for self-preservation made men quit their units. The sinister end to the first day of winter ranked but the start of our woe. So they're really suffering. And just to touch base a little bit more on the horses, what was happening with the ice and the snow, horses could have on their horseshoe something called basically like a spike. It's called a calkin. It's sort of to give them traction on ice, little stubs on the bottom of their horseshoe. But the French didn't have those, so their horses were slipping. And the Polish horses did. So the Polish horses had a little better traction. The Russian horses weren't shoed, so they just had their natural hooves, and they had a little better traction. But a lot of horses would slip, and it would be hard for them to get. They couldn't move. And Napoleon writes that with this cold, over a course of just a few days, they lost 30,000 horses that froze to death. And just to illustrate this sort of the deprivation and the savagery, or the desperation these folks were in, when the horses died, they would eat them, and they would cook them when they could. But when they couldn't cook them, they would eat them raw. So it's just really really desperate level of attempt for survival. And then this is our last image of Napoleon. This is him warming himself by a fire, and this is the sketch in the field, and this is the final work. He's sort of incognito a little bit. You can see him here. He's got a big hat on. He said, Faber de Faur says, who knows what must be going through his head as his pitiful army files past. Fires fed by broken wheels and gun carriages. Napoleon partially disguised by a fur hat. So, you think of some of those other great images of Napoleon by some of the French painters, and how glorious, and his emperor's robes, and then this reality here of just this army here, just broken bits of things, just totally suffering. It's just quite a contrast. As the army's retreating, they get to Smolensk, and as I said earlier, the city was burned. There was no shelter there, so they had to just keep moving. This is where they started abandoning their cannons. The first time they were abandoning cannons, and as for artillery people, to give up your cannons, you're basically giving up, because that's your means of fighting. So it was a real morale drop for them to have to throw their cannons into the Dnieper River. But and they just had to keep going, so they didn't really stay in Smolensk very long. And this image, at least I can sip water. This image is, to me, sort of an iconic image in the Faber de Faur journal. And it captures so much. I think I'll let Faber de Faur describe it to you, but you can see this is in the retreat. And this is something that he describes. He says, Russian columns shouted us, but at a distance, as they too were suffering from the intemperate climate. However, we were still surrounded by clouds of Cossacks and bands of armed peasants, and this made it very dangerous to stray from the main road or lag behind. Here we see a typical scene, something that happened every day. A wounded officer and his wife, after considerable effort to get this far, have just seen the horse pulling their sledge collapse and die. The bulk of the army has passed by, but there is still some hope that the rear guard might be able to assist them. The Cossacks appear. The compassion and bravery of a handful of soldiers serves as some encouragement for the unlucky pair, but they are now without transport, and if the rear guard does not take pity on them, they will be abandoned and captivity will follow. Either that or they will perish victims of the murderous climate. And a word about the murderous climate, in the various diaries, they talk about the temperature, and it starts at 15 below zero, 20 below zero, 25 below zero, 30 degrees below zero. It's so cold that Captain von Brandt, the Polish officer, says when shoes would be removed from dead troops, the toes were so cold that the toes would break like twigs. So just to give you a sense of how horribly cold it was. It's late November, so we're almost out of Russia, but we still have a little ways to go. And this scene at the Beresina River was a real hell in itself, a mini hell in itself, as I interpret it. The French had been able to deceive the Russians a little bit about where they were going to cross the river, and that bought them a little bit of time, and they built 2 temporary bridges. And initially, the only troops that could go across were those that still had their weapons. So if you didn't have a weapon, you had to wait. So all the troops that had weapons first crossed. And then the larger mass of troops that didn't have weapons, all these people, they came on the 27th and 28th. And basically, there was this surge, a huge surge to get across the river. And it was a human stampede. People were thrust into the freezing waters of the Beresina or pushed into the flames of the burning houses between the 2 bridges. The desperation of this mass reached fever pitch. Each Russian shell, so now the Russians had come up and they were now shooting at them in sort of like apples in a barrel. Each Russian shell around found a target, and swaths of the unfortunate were cut down. In a convulsed way, they surged forward, crushing the dead and dying underfoot. So it's just this, more ways to die, to drown, to be stampeded to death. Just the list of ways you could sustain injury or death was just really incredible. So 20,000 of these folks didn't make it across the river on the morning of the 29th of November. The bridges were burned so that the Russians couldn't get the main body of the army. And so about 20,000 there were captured. This is on the other side of the river, on the right bank. The army has sort of created a little bit of distance from the Russians because they burned the bridges. And this too is another example of just this drive for survival and the brutality of what could happen. And so here, Faber de Faur's unit comes up and they said, we arrived late, there was no food, and soon a fighting broke out, but not as one might expect, for room inside the houses, but for the houses themselves. The soldiers, maddened by the cold, had clambered onto the roofs and started to demolish the houses for firewood. The occupiers fought vainly to prevent this, but by the following morning, the houses had disappeared, consumed by countless campfires. So you can see this trooper back here, they're literally tearing down the house for firewood. You can imagine if you're one of the earlier troops that arrived and was inside the building trying to just go to sleep, your structure's being literally torn apart. So just to show you how cold it was. Von Brandt, the Polish officer again, he talks about going up, so during the retreat in the night you would see campfires, and his unit came upon a campfire and they went up to the campfire, And there were a whole bunch of troopers huddled around the campfire, but they were all frozen. The fire was burning brightly, but the troops around were all frozen. There was no one alive, and they slept with them there just around these corpses. And there had been an embankment that blocked the wind. It was covered with snow, and the wind removed that snow. In the morning, they saw that embankment was just a heap of corpses. So just this macabre scenes around fire. And Walter, the enlisted man, he talks about fires. There's sort of a protocol. If you wanted to get up close to the fire, you had to bring something. You had to bring some firewood. You had to bring some food. And sometimes soldiers would team up, and one guy might have fat and another one some grain or something. They could mix the two together, so there'd be a little bit of, sort of trading to get access to those fires. And we're really just coming to this sort of end now. So the army is almost out of Russia, just a couple days away. And this is a sort of our last image we'll look at of the sort of a battle scene. And this, so there are some Russians here, sort of just in a distance. But this I think really summarizes what was happening here, the inhumanity among the army, amongst itself. It's separate from the Russians, but. He says here, and this is really, quite insightful, he says, the cold was getting worse, and we were losing more men and horses. The army dragged itself forward, littering the road with its dead, dying, and deranged. We were constantly harassed by bands of Cossacks, greedy for booty. Armed men gathered in bands, and there was running battles in the snow with a few pieces of artillery, dragged all the way without horses, firing their final discharges in Russia. Mixed in with such bravery was, however, as much cruelty and a revolting selfishness. The strongest pillaged the weakest. The sick were stripped of their clothing, and the dying were robbed of their clothes and left to die in the deep snow. An instinct for self-preservation had snuffed out all traces of humanity in the human heart. You can see here they're stripping their own guys. This guy has his shoes removed, and he's still alive. These guys are helpless, and they're taking the clothing off them, their own men. So it's just really survival of the fittest. And then this is our last image, and the army is now, they've just got out of Russia. And actually, it's sort of ironic I'm here today because yesterday really was technically, I guess, the 209th anniversary of the French army exiting Russia, December 14th. But obviously they're trickling out over a few days, but right around this time was considered, the anniversary of them exiting Russia. So this is a few days after the exit, and you can see now they're nicely clothed, they have nice boots, they've got horses and nice sledges, so he's really communicating that they're out, they're surviving. Now these guys they've had a meal in this inn, and now they're heading off back to home. But he summarizes this, and this will just be where I will end. He said, as 1812 came to an end, so too did the incredible suffering. The fatal retreat from Moscow was over. So too was the Grand Armée. It no longer existed. It left its glorious remains on the fields of Krasno, Smolensk, Valentina, Polotsk, Borodino, and over the endless steppes of Russia. It had been consumed by disease, hunger, want, and the rigors of a wrathful climate. So of those 600,000 men who went in late June, 500,000 did not make it out. They lost 180,000 horses, they had 1,000 cannons, and Napoleon had left the army a couple weeks before but he went back to Paris for sort of damage control, and so he had left the army in late November, early December. Murat sort of took over after he left. But it's just sort of interesting to sort of share his perspective. So, on the December 21st, he receives a dispatch. So they're out of the country. They've had this horrific defeat. And he receives a memorandum from his chief of staff, from Berthier, and about their losses. And he writes to Berthier and says, "Yep, I got your memo about the losses, and I'm gonna consider them most anxiously." Then he pivots. He says, "This year's conscription is splendid. I had about 25 or 30,000 men on parade on Sunday." So Napoleon is ready to move forward again after this horrific experience in Russia. So that concludes my comments. I hope that gives you a sense of that invasion and what was experienced throughout that campaign. It's sort of a whirlwind tour, but thank you for your attention.
So we'll take questions, right and left. I think you've given us 40 minutes of living in hell, but so please raise your hand and Andrew will respond.
Thank you very much. It's really a great talk.
Thank you.
They seem to have started with a poor supply chain and disorganized. I thought Napoleon was famous for he had won so many battles in a row since he had been young. And part of the reason he had won them was that the French army and he were very well organized on supply and organization, but it looks like they didn't have it here.
Yeah, so they did organize. They spent the first 6 months of 1812 doing that, getting supplies, putting provisions along the way. But the logistics, once they got into Russia, they got hit with a lot of rain, muddy roads. They couldn't get a lot of their supplies up to the troops that needed them. So they had some good planning, but it didn't work out when they experienced the realities of the campaign. And that coupled with the fact that the land had been stripped already of everything, it made it very hard for them to live off the land.
I may have missed it. What was the trigger to retreat, to go back?
Yeah, I can repeat the question. He's asking why did they retreat at that time? So they were in Moscow for 5 weeks, and Napoleon was trying to get the Russians to surrender, and then he realized that they weren't going to surrender, and he couldn't stay in Moscow. It had been destroyed. There was no provisions and food, so they had to leave. They didn't really have a choice, but the fact that the Russians wouldn't surrender was the trigger. During those 5 weeks, he was there was diplomatic missions, letters, communications to the Russians, but they didn't bite. And Napoleon didn't really want to be in Russia during the winter, but he played his hand wrong in terms of the timing, and so he got caught in the winter on the retreat. But it was the Russians' lack of willingness to surrender that triggered the retreat.
Yeah, you mentioned a little bit about War and Peace in there. And in War and Peace, Tolstoy gives the impression that the Russians were very disorganized too, and that the Tsar didn't have control of his generals, and his generals were fighting each other. And so it just sounds horrible, but it's horrible for the Russians, who were also disorganized, and it was their country, I guess, and so they were able to survive, whereas Napoleon just couldn't get any control of the country.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. The Russians changed their senior commanders. Kutuzov was put in after the 6 weeks or so. He was put in as the new commander, so there was a change in the senior command. They were retreating, and that was the right strategy, but they needed to take a stand, so they did put in new senior command. So yeah, there was positioning, and to change your senior command in the middle of an invasion is reflects your point. Yeah, there was disorganization, and I think Tolstoy captures that accurately.
Andrew, in your readings of the journals and the comments of Faber de Faur, was there any commentary on Napoleon's leadership? Did they dare criticize or second guess?
Yeah.
What did you pick up on that?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because you would think that they would criticize, but by and large, the comments in the diaries were all very positive. It's hard for us to imagine the magnetism that he had. I mean, he was this larger-than-life figure, and he had so much victory in many of his other battles. He was seen as this very charismatic leader, and nothing could go wrong against him. So I'd say it was roughly 90% very positive, and then a little bit of grousing, but not too much.
Do we have more questions? Yes.
Yes, I noticed in the sketches of Faber de Faur
You don't see, he didn't seem to make many sketches of Napoleon himself.
Right.
In his grandeur on his horse, like you know, if you open any history book, you always see Napoleon sitting on his white horse and all
Right.
the grandeur. You don't see that much. Did he not do a lot of sketches of Napoleon? You think he would?
So remember, he's an artillery officer who's in a war situation, so he only got snippet views of Napoleon. He was in a German division, so he wasn't like in the Imperial Guard where he might see Napoleon more regularly. So the one image you saw of, they were marching by and they saw him sitting down, so that was an image that resonated and he captured. And then Napoleon on the horse as they left Moscow, so everyone marched by him, so they saw him then. But yeah, he didn't get a lot of opportunities to see Napoleon, so that's why he really didn't sketch him that often.
Could you comment a little more about his sketching technique, his materials, things are in motion. So, how did he do this and what materials was he using?
Yeah. So I'll look in the provenance really to answer that. So he would, pencil, the water, the final artwork was watercolors, and so he used colored ink, wash sketches. These were the tools he used. Some watercolors, but mostly colored ink. He was drawing, he was drawing in the field. That was typically the way the way he captured. He did his sketching.
Could you compare the retreat of Hitler from Russia?
Sure. So that's a question I anticipated because a lot of people always talk about Napoleon and talk about Hitler. And the contemporary book that I also referenced here by Alistair Horn, he talks a lot about that. And this is sort of this is a bonus slide, so to speak. But basically, there were all these similarities, right? That they launched the attack too late. Their supply lines were extended. They were fighting wars on two fronts, Hitler with Britain and Russia, and Napoleon down in the Peninsular War, Spain, Portugal, and then Russia. So they didn't have the right clothing. They both tried quick attacks. The cold hurt them, but so did the heat. Both armies, the Germans in World War II and the French, and both suffered from privation. So these were all sort of the similarities. Hitler probably thought because he had mechanized and mechanized, he might be able to go faster. But he didn't get to Moscow. He got to the outskirts of Moscow. Napoleon did, but there wasn't much there when he got there. But that was sort of a summary of the Alistair Horn take on Hitler and Napoleon.
Andrew, thank you so much. On the RMA, I want to give you this certificate of appreciation.